The morning of April 29, 1901, rose softly over the imperial palace in Tokyo. The air carried the gentle chill of spring, as the gardens glistened with dew, and within the grand yet solemn walls of the palace, a cry pierced the quiet dawn. A son was born to Crown Prince Yoshihito and Crown Princess Sadako. They named him Hirohito. In that moment, no one could have foreseen that this small, fragile child would grow to lead Japan through one of the most turbulent and transformative chapters in human history. Hirohito was born into a nation already in the midst of profound change. Just decades earlier, the Meiji Restoration had ripped Japan from centuries of isolation, thrusting it into the modern world. Steamships now plied Japanese waters, telegraph lines connected cities, and Western ideas mingled uneasily with ancient traditions. For the young prince, this meant he was to be raised as both a living symbol of an unbroken imperial line stretching back millennia, and as a modern ruler expected to guide Japan in an era of global power politics. From the age of 3, Hirohito was separated from his parents, as imperial custom dictated. He grew up under the strict supervision of court tutors and officials, whose mission was to shape him into a disciplined, stoic leader worthy of the Chrysanthemum Throne. His days were structured, his emotions contained, his world defined by ritual and restraint. Yet, within this highly controlled life, a spark of curiosity took root. Science fascinated him, particularly marine biology. Even as a boy, he would gaze into tanks of sea creatures with quiet fascination, studying their movements, memorizing their details. This passion would stay with him throughout his life, a private solace amid the storms of public duty. By the time Hirohito reached his teenage years, Japan had emerged as a formidable world power. Victories in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War had elevated national pride and ambition. As the future emperor, Hirohito understood that his life was not his own. He was a vessel for the will of a nation. In 1921, at the age of 20, he embarked on a journey that would mark a turning point in his understanding of the world. For the first time in history, a Japanese crown prince traveled abroad. His destination was Europe, a continent still reeling from the devastation of the First World War. For 6 months, Hirohito toured Britain, France, Italy, and Belgium. In London, he dined with King George V, observed the British Navy with keen interest, and studied Europe's industrial might. But beyond the grandeur of royal banquets and military parades, he saw something else. The fragility of nations worn down by war, the political instability brewing beneath polished exteriors. These impressions would stay with him, shaping his perception of global politics and Japan's role in it. When Hirohito returned home, he did so as more than a curious prince. He returned as a man who had glimpsed the possibilities and perils of the wider world. Later that same year, when his father's health declined, Hirohito assumed the role of regent. At just 20 years old, he became the de facto ruler of Japan. Reserved by nature, cautious in demeanor, he bore the responsibility with a quiet gravity that belied his youth. On December 25, 1926, Emperor Taisho died, and Hirohito ascended the Chrysanthemum Throne as the 124th Emperor of Japan. Posthumously, he would be known as Emperor Showa, meaning enlightened peace. The irony of that name would not be lost on history. His reign began at a moment of profound uncertainty. Japan was at a crossroads, torn between democratic aspirations and the rising tide of militarism. The global economic depression and deep-seated resentment over perceived racial discrimination by Western powers stoked nationalist fervor. Though the Meiji Constitution technically limited the emperor's role to a symbolic one, the reality was far more complex. To the Japanese people, Hirohito was not merely a monarch, he was a living god, the direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His words carried divine weight. His presence inspired unquestioned obedience. This duality, limited constitutional power but limitless moral authority, would define the moral ambiguity of his reign. The 1930s brought darker winds. In 1931, the Japanese military staged the Mukden Incident and invaded Manchuria, acting without full government approval. While Hirohito was not directly involved in orchestrating the plot, he sanctioned the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo under the last Qing emperor, Puyi. This was a critical moment. Japan had crossed the threshold from defensive modernization to aggressive imperialism. As the decade progressed, Japan's ambitions grew. In 1937, A clash at the Marco Polo Bridge spiraled into full-scale war with China. Cities burned, and atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre shocked the world. Hirohito's role during these years remains one of history's most debated questions. Some view him as a powerless figurehead, swept along by the tides of militarism. Others argue he was a complicit leader, quietly endorsing Japan's expansionist path. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Publicly, he embodied divine authority, urging his people onward. Privately, he sometimes expressed doubts, urging caution, but never enough to alter Japan's trajectory. Propaganda elevated him to near-mythic status. His portrait adorned every classroom, every government office. School children bowed each morning before his image. To defy Japan's war effort was to defy the emperor himself. Meanwhile, Hirohito spent hours in his marine biology lab, immersed in the study of sea life, even as his nation plunged deeper into a cataclysmic war. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, launching the Pacific War and dragging the United States into World War II. The decision had been fiercely debated within the Japanese government. Hirohito had voiced concerns about war with such a powerful adversary. But when the military insisted and his advisors presented the plan, he gave the imperial sanction required to proceed. The attack transformed the conflict into a global struggle, and to many Japanese it seemed as though their emperor's divine will had ordained victory. The early months of the war brought triumph after triumph: Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Japanese forces appeared unstoppable, but by 1943 the tide began to turn. American industrial might and relentless island-hopping campaigns eroded Japan's conquests. Hirohito followed the developments closely, receiving detailed reports and occasionally questioning strategy, yet he never challenged his generals directly. His image as a divine leader sustained national resolve even as defeat became inevitable. By the summer of 1945, Japan lay in ruins. Firebombing had reduced Tokyo and other cities to ash, and still the government refused to surrender. Then came August 6 and 9, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2 atomic bombs obliterated entire cities, killing tens of thousands in an instant, and leaving many more to suffer indescribable agony. For Hirohito, the moment of decision had arrived. On August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. In a recorded radio broadcast, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. His words were couched in formal, archaic language, but their meaning was unmistakable. Japan had lost. We have decided to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come, by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable, he said. In that moment, the God Emperor became human. The divine voice of a 1,000-year dynasty had spoken not of glory, but of survival. His reign had carried Japan from the heights of imperial ambition to the depths of catastrophic defeat. What came next would test not only his ability to adapt, but the very meaning of monarchy in a new, shattered Japan. Part 1 ends here. In Part 2, we will follow Hirohito's transformation from the symbol of a wartime empire to a constitutional monarch, navigating occupation, democracy, the Cold War, and the reckoning with his own legacy. The war was over, but Japan lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ashes, industries shattered, millions homeless, hungry, and grieving. Amid the devastation, the figure of Hirohito loomed larger than ever. To the outside world, he was the man whose nation had brought death and destruction across Asia and the Pacific, whose image had been the banner of militarism. To the Japanese people, he remained the emperor, still revered as a divine being, though that divinity now hung under a shadow. How could a god lead his nation to such ruin? And yet, in the wake of surrender, Hirohito faced a choice that would define the rest of his life: to cling to the old world of absolute imperial power, or to adapt and survive in a world that demanded change. When Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, occupied Japan, there were voices calling for Hirohito to be tried as a war criminal, even executed. Many in the United States saw him as the ultimate symbol of Japanese aggression. But MacArthur, pragmatic and far-sighted, chose a different path. He believed Hirohito could be the key to stabilizing post-war Japan. If the emperor urged cooperation, the Japanese people, still deeply loyal to him, would follow. In the months after surrender, Hirohito made a decision that stunned many. On January 1, 1946, he issued what came to be known as the Humanity Declaration. In a formal statement to the Japanese people, he renounced the notion of his divinity. He declared that the ties between emperor and people were not based on myth, but on mutual trust and respect. For a man raised from birth as a living god, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The divine emperor had chosen to become mortal. The new Japan that emerged under Allied occupation was unlike anything Hirohito had ever known. The old militarist state was dismantled. A new constitution, drafted largely by American officials but endorsed by Japanese leaders, transformed the emperor into a purely symbolic figurehead. The government would now be parliamentary and democratic. Sovereignty resided with the people, not the throne. Hirohito's role was ceremonial. He would open parliament, attend state functions, greet foreign dignitaries, but he would no longer command armies or influence policy. Remarkably, Hirohito adapted. Rather than resist these changes, he embraced them publicly. He toured the devastated countryside, meeting ordinary Japanese citizens face to face for the first time. He visited farms, schools, factories, and hospitals. These tours were carefully orchestrated by the occupation authorities. But they also revealed a genuine shift in Hirohito himself. He began to see his people not as subjects to be ruled from above, but as citizens whose trust he needed to earn. For many Japanese, these encounters were transformative. They saw an emperor who was not aloof and distant, but a man walking among them, bowing to them, asking about their hardships. The myth of the untouchable god had been replaced by the image of a humble monarch. This was no small feat. Japan's recovery in the late 1940s and 1950s owed much to its people's resilience and the American-led Reconstruction. But Hirohito's presence as a unifying symbol helped hold the nation together during a time of profound upheaval. As the Cold War took shape, Japan found itself in a new geopolitical reality. The United States, once its bitter enemy, became its protector and partner. The Korean War in 1950 spurred Japan's economic revival as American demand for goods fueled industrial growth. By the 1960s, Japan was no longer a nation of ruins, but an economic powerhouse, its cities rebuilt, its industries thriving, its culture once again vibrant. Through it all, Hirohito remained on the throne, a quiet constant amid rapid change. Yet, the shadows of the past never fully faded. Abroad, many still saw Hirohito as the wartime emperor who had presided over atrocities in Asia. Within Japan, younger generations began to question the legacy of the imperial system itself. Student protests in the 1960s often targeted the monarchy as a relic of a bygone era. And while Hirohito rarely spoke about the war, when he did, his words were cautious, carefully chosen, never fully apologetic. He expressed sorrow for the suffering caused but stopped short of admitting personal responsibility. This ambiguity continued to define his image, to some a symbol of continuity and stability, to others a man who had escaped accountability. Privately, Hirohito found solace where he always had, in science. His fascination with marine biology grew into serious scholarship. He published numerous papers, contributed to the classification of species, and spent long hours in his laboratory. For him, perhaps, the ocean's quiet mysteries provided relief from the burdens of history that clung to his name. The post-war decades saw Hirohito gradually recede from the center of Japan's public life. Prime ministers came and went, economic booms and recessions ebbed and flowed, but the emperor endured. Foreign dignitaries visited, and Hirohito traveled abroad, including a historic visit to the United States in 1975, where he met President Gerald Ford and stood in the White House as the once enemy emperor of Japan, now an ally. The symbolism was profound. A nation that had waged a bitter, total war now stood reconciled with its former foe. As Hirohito aged, Japan entered a new era. By the 1980s, it had become a global economic superpower, its cars, electronics, and technology known worldwide. Hirohito, frail but still active, presided over a nation utterly transformed from the one he had inherited. And yet, the unresolved questions of his wartime role persisted. In the West, historians continued to debate whether he had been a passive figurehead or an active participant in Japan's militarism. In Japan, the topic was often avoided, a silence born of respect, discomfort, and a desire to move forward. In September 1988, Hirohito fell seriously ill. As he lay dying, Japan confronted the end of an era. For over 60 years, he had been its emperor. Through empire and war, defeat and rebirth, isolation and integration into the modern world. On January 7, 1989, Emperor Hirohito died at the age of 87. His death marked not just the passing of a man but the close of a historical chapter. With him ended the Showa era, a period of extraordinary transformation that had seen Japan rise, fall, and rise again. The world remembered him with mixed emotions. To many Japanese, he was the monarch who had guided them through unprecedented change, a figure of stability in a tumultuous century. To others, especially in countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation, he remained a symbol of unatoned crimes. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from around the globe, a testament to Japan's post-war reintegration into the international community. Hirohito's legacy is as complex as the century he lived through. He began life as a divine heir, worship as a god-king, destined to lead Japan to glory. He presided over an empire that sought domination and brought devastation, then survived its total collapse to become a constitutional monarch in a democratic, pacifist nation. He was a man of contradictions, a shy, studious scientist and a wartime emperor, a symbol of unchanging tradition and of radical adaptation. In the end, perhaps Hirohito's greatest achievement was survival of himself, of his throne, and of a nation that reinvented itself from the ashes of war. His story is not just the tale of a man but of a country's journey through the fires of history into the modern age. And as Japan moved forward into the Heisei era under his son, Emperor Akihito, the shadow of the Showa emperor lingered, part god, part man, and entirely inseparable from the story of 20th century Japan.